the most powerful man in show business, was on his knees in a parking lot outside the Beverly Hills Hotel at 11:30 p.m. on June 14, 1963, begging for forgiveness from a man who had never asked him for anything. Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board, the man who could make presidents sweat and mob bosses smile, was pleading with Deana Martin like a child who had broken his mother's favorite vase. The rain was starting to fall, soaking through Frank's $1,000 tuxedo, but he didn't move. He couldn't move, because for the first time in his adult life, Frank Sinatra understood what it meant to need someone more than they needed him. What had brought the most feared entertainer in America to his knees wasn't a business deal, or a romantic entanglement, or a career crisis. It was something far more devastating, the realization that he had crossed the one line Deana Martin would never allow anyone to cross. Frank had disrespected Dean's family, and in Dean's world, that was an unforgivable sin that no amount of fame, friendship, or shared history could excuse. The Beverly Hills Hotel's crystal ballroom was transformed into a fairy tale setting for Deana Martin's wedding to actor Terry Melcher. White roses and gardenias filled every corner of the room, their perfume mixing with the scent of expensive champagne and the subtle cologne worn by Hollywood's most powerful figures. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables filled with the entertainment industry's elite directors, producers, stars, and power brokers who had come to celebrate the marriage of Deana Martin's beloved daughter. Deana was Dean's pride and joy, the apple of his eye, the one person in the world who could make the king of cool show genuine emotion in public. At 24, she was beautiful, intelligent, and possessed of the same natural charisma that had made her father famous. More importantly, she was kind, unspoiled by the privilege of growing up as Hollywood royalty, and deserving of a perfect wedding day that would remain a beautiful memory for the rest of her life. Dean had spared no expense for his daughter's special day. The guest list read like a who's who of American entertainment. The menu featured delicacies flown in from around the world. A full orchestra provided music for dancing, while photographers captured every moment for posterity. Everything was perfect, elegant, and designed to give Deana the wedding of her dreams. Frank Sinatra had been invited not just as Dean's Rat Pack partner, but as a family friend who had watched Deana grow up from a child into a young woman. Frank's presence at the wedding was both an honor for the bride and groom and a sign of the deep bonds that connected the Sinatra and Martin families. When Frank RSVP'd yes to the invitation, everyone expected him to be charming, entertaining, and appropriately respectful of the occasion's significance. What they got instead was a master class in self-destruction. Frank arrived at the Beverly Hills Hotel 3 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin, already showing signs of having spent the afternoon with a bottle of Jack Daniels. His tuxedo was impeccable, his hair perfectly styled, but his eyes had the glassy shine that came from liquid courage consumed in dangerous quantities. Those close to Frank knew the warning signs, the forced smile that didn't reach his eyes, the slightly too loud laughter, the way he stood just a little too close to people when he spoke. The problem was that Frank Sinatra drunk was a completely different creature from Frank Sinatra sober. Sober Frank was charming, professional, capable of reading a room and adjusting his behavior accordingly. Drunk Frank was unpredictable, volatile, and prone to saying exactly what he thought regardless of the consequences. On most nights, in most venues, drunk Frank was manageable because everyone around him was either on his payroll or afraid to challenge him. But Deana Martin's wedding wasn't most venues, and Deana Martin wasn't most people. The first sign of trouble came during the cocktail hour, when Frank decided to regale a group of guests with an increasingly inappropriate story about a recent romantic conquest. The story involved explicit details, crude language, and a married woman whose husband was standing less than 10 feet away. Dean, who was circulating among his guests and ensuring everyone felt welcome, noticed the uncomfortable expressions on people's faces as Frank's voice carried across the room. Dean approached the group with his trademark easy smile, but those who knew him well could see the tension around his eyes. He placed a gentle hand on Frank's shoulder and leaned in close, his voice too quiet for others to hear. "Hey Frank," Dean said, his tone friendly but firm. "Maybe save the war stories for later, huh? This is Deana's day." Frank looked at Dean with the kind of bleary-eyed confusion that comes from trying to process criticism through an alcohol-induced fog. For a moment it seemed like he might take the hint and moderate his behavior. Instead, he clapped Dean on the back with unnecessary force and laughed too loudly. "Relax, Dino," Frank said, his voice carrying across the room. "These people need to loosen up. This party's deader than a mob snitch." The comment landed like a stone in a still pond, creating ripples of discomfort that spread throughout the room. Several guests exchanged glances, unsure whether Frank was joking or genuinely oblivious to how inappropriate his behavior was becoming. Dean maintained his smile, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Just dial it back a notch, okay?" Dean said quietly, for Deana. Frank nodded enthusiastically, but his definition of dialing it back proved to be very different from everyone else's. During the ceremony itself, Frank provided a running commentary of whispered remarks that were just loud enough to be distracting, but not quite loud enough to justify a direct confrontation. When the minister asked if anyone objected to the union, Frank stage whispered, "I object to the catering. Where's the pasta?" Dean stood at the altar, watching his daughter exchange vows, trying to focus on the joy of the moment, while simultaneously monitoring Frank's behavior like a parent watching a misbehaving child. Every inappropriate comment, every unnecessary laugh, every attention-seeking gesture was another needle of irritation piercing through what should have been pure happiness. But Frank was just getting started. The real disaster began during the reception dinner, when Frank had somehow managed to consume enough additional alcohol to push himself from merely inappropriate into actively destructive territory. He had commandeered the microphone from the master of ceremonies and launched into what he apparently thought was an entertaining impromptu performance. What started as a supposedly heartfelt toast to the bride quickly devolved into a rambling, stream-of-consciousness monologue that touched on Frank's various grievances, romantic adventures, and opinions about everyone in the room. He made crude jokes about marriage, inappropriate comments about Deana's appearance, and increasingly personal observations about the other guests' private lives. The room fell into the kind of uncomfortable silence that occurs when people realize they're witnessing a train wreck, but are powerless to stop it. Deana's face showed a mixture of embarrassment and hurt, as her special day was being hijacked by a man who was supposed to be celebrating her happiness. Terry Melcher, the groom, looked like he was considering whether tackling Frank would cause more or less of a scene than letting him continue. Deana Martin stood at his table, his hands gripping the edge so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. For 30 years, Dean had watched Frank Sinatra get away with behavior that would have ended other people's careers because Frank's talent and power made him seemingly untouchable. Dean had made excuses, provided damage control, and covered for Frank's worst impulses because that's what friends did for each other in their world. But this was different. This wasn't a nightclub, or a recording studio, or a movie set where Frank's antics were part of the show. This was Dean's daughter's wedding day, a sacred moment that was supposed to create beautiful memories for his family. And Frank Sinatra, in his selfish, drunken narcissism, was destroying it. The breaking point came when Frank, apparently thinking he was being charming, began to tell a story about Deana as a child that involved details no father once shared publicly about his daughter. The story wasn't malicious, but it was intimate, embarrassing, and completely inappropriate for a wedding reception filled with colleagues, friends, and distant relatives. Deana Martin had heard enough. Without saying a word, Dean stood up from his table and walked toward the bandstand where Frank was holding court. His movement was fluid, controlled, and purposeful, the walk of a man who had made a decision and was going to see it through regardless of the consequences. The room fell silent as Dean approached, everyone sensing that something significant was about to happen. Frank, lost in his own performance and oblivious to the building tension, continued his inappropriate story until Dean was standing directly beside him. Only then did Frank notice that his audience wasn't laughing anymore, that the room had gone completely quiet, and that Deana Martin was looking at him with an expression that would have made smarter men run for the exits. "Frank," Dean said, his voice calm and conversational, "I need to talk to you." "In a minute, Dino," Frank replied, waving him off. "I'm in the middle of—" "Now," Dean interrupted, and something in his tone made Frank finally understand that this wasn't a request. Dean took the microphone from Frank's hands with a gentle but irresistible firmness, like a parent removing a dangerous toy from a child. He handed it to the bandleader with a nod that conveyed everything necessary about resuming normal reception activities. Then he placed his hand on Frank's arm and guided him away from the bandstand toward a side door that led to the hotel's garden terrace. The two men who had dominated American entertainment for a decade walked outside into the cool evening air, leaving behind a room full of people who were collectively holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The terrace was quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic on Sunset Boulevard, and the muffled music from the reception inside. City lights twinkled in the distance, and the air carried the scent of jasmine from the hotel's gardens. Under different circumstances, it might have been a peaceful setting for two old friends to share a private conversation. Instead, it became the stage for a confrontation that would forever change the dynamic between two of the most powerful men in show business. Deana Martin stood with his back to the ballroom doors, his posture relaxed, but his eyes carrying a cold anger that Frank had never seen before. Frank, meanwhile, was beginning to sober up just enough to realize that he might be in serious trouble, though he wasn't yet sure exactly what he had done wrong. "What's the problem, Dino?" Frank asked, his voice carrying a mixture of confusion and defensive bravado. "I was just trying to liven things up. These society types need someone to show them how to have fun." Dean studied Frank's face for a long moment, as if he were seeing his longtime partner clearly for the first time. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, and absolutely lethal. "That's my daughter in there, Frank, my little girl. Today is supposed to be the happiest day of her life, and you're turning it into a circus." Frank tried to wave off Dean's concerns with the kind of casual dismissal that had worked countless times before. "Come on, Dean. I was just having a little fun. Deana knows I love her. She knows I was just—" "You were just what?" Dean interrupted, his voice still quiet, but carrying an edge that made Frank take a step backward. "Just embarrassing her in front of her new husband's family? Just making crude jokes about her childhood? Just turning her wedding reception into the Frank Sinatra show?" The words hit Frank like physical blows, each one accurate and devastating. For the first time, Frank began to understand how his behavior appeared to someone who wasn't afraid of him, someone who cared more about protecting his family than maintaining their friendship. "I didn't mean," Frank started, but Dean cut him off again. "I don't care what you meant, Frank. I care what you did, and what you did was disrespect my family at the most important moment in my daughter's life." Dean stepped closer to Frank, closing the distance between them until they were standing face to face. The contrast between them was stark. Dean composed and controlled, despite his anger. Frank disheveled and confused, despite his attempts to maintain his usual commanding presence. "Here's what's going to happen," Dean continued, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "You're going to go back in there, apologize to Deana and Terry, wish them well, and then you're going to leave, quietly, without any more speeches, stories, or performances." Frank's face flushed with anger and humiliation. No one spoke to Frank Sinatra this way. No one gave Frank Sinatra ultimatums. He was the chairman of the board, the leader of their group, the man whose approval everyone sought. "Who do you think you're talking to?" Frank demanded, his voice rising with indignation. "I made you, Dean. I brought you into the group. I made you part of something bigger than you ever could have been on your own." It was exactly the wrong thing to say. Deana Martin's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a coldness that spoke of bridges being burned and relationships being permanently altered. When he replied, his voice was calm, almost conversational, which somehow made his words more devastating than if he had shouted. "And I'm grateful for that, Frank. I really am. But you didn't make me a father. You didn't make me a man who protects his family. And if you think our friendship gives you the right to humiliate my daughter on her wedding day, then maybe our friendship isn't what I thought it was." The silence that followed was deafening. Frank stood there, swaying slightly from the alcohol and the shock of hearing Dean speak to him with such finality. For 30 years, Frank had been accustomed to getting his way through a combination of charm, intimidation, and the implicit threat of his displeasure. But Deana Martin wasn't intimidated, and he clearly didn't care about Frank's displeasure. "Dean, come on," Frank said, his voice taking on a pleading quality that surprised them both. "You know I didn't mean to hurt Deana. I was having a good time. Maybe I went a little overboard, but—" "A little overboard?" Dean's voice remained calm, but his words carried the weight of absolute judgment. "Frank, you humiliated my daughter at her own wedding. You turned what should have been a beautiful memory into something she'll want to forget. That's not overboard. That's unforgivable." Dean turned toward the door, preparing to return to his daughter's reception. "You have 5 minutes to say goodbye to Deana and leave. After that, hotel security will escort you out." Frank grabbed Dean's arm as he reached for the door handle. "Wait, Dean, please, don't do this. Don't throw away 30 years over one stupid night. Dean looked down at Frank's hand on his arm, then back up at Frank's face. I'm not throwing anything away, Frank. You did that all by yourself. What happened next was unprecedented in the history of their relationship. Frank Sinatra, the most powerful entertainer in America, the man who had never backed down from anyone, slowly released Dean's arm and took a step backward. His face showed a mixture of shock, hurt, and something that might have been fear. "What do you want me to do?" Frank asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to leave my daughter's wedding," Dean replied simply, "and then I want you to think about whether our friendship means enough to you to change how you treat the people I love." Dean opened the door and disappeared back into the ballroom, leaving Frank alone on the terrace with the weight of his actions and the realization that he had just lost something he couldn't afford to lose. Inside the ballroom, Dean returned to his table as if nothing had happened. He smiled at his guests, danced with his daughter, and made sure everyone felt welcome and appreciated, but those closest to him could see the tension in his shoulders, the forced quality of his cheerfulness, and the way his eyes occasionally drifted toward the terrace door. Frank Sinatra re-entered the ballroom 5 minutes later, moving through the crowd like a ghost. He approached Deana and Terry at the head table, said something brief and quiet that made Deana nod graciously, and then left through the main entrance without speaking to anyone else. The reception continued without incident, but everyone who had witnessed Frank's earlier behavior and his subsequent departure understood that something fundamental had changed in the relationship between two of entertainment's biggest stars. Outside in the hotel parking lot, Frank Sinatra sat in his car for nearly an hour, staring at the building where his best friend's daughter was celebrating the happiest day of her life without him. The rain that had been threatening all evening finally began to fall, pattering against his windshield like tears. It was there, in that parking lot, that Frank Sinatra experienced something he had never felt before: genuine remorse combined with the terrifying realization that his actions had consequences even for him. Deana Martin wasn't an employee who could be fired, a critic who could be ignored, or a rival who could be destroyed. Dean was his friend, his partner, and the one person whose respect Frank had always been able to count on. Now that respect was gone, and Frank understood with crystal clarity that he was the only one who could earn it back. The reconciliation, when it came, was unlike anything Frank had ever experienced. 3 days after the wedding, Frank appeared at Dean's Beverly Hills home carrying a huge bouquet of flowers for Deana and a handwritten letter of apology that was both humble and heartfelt. Dean let him in, listened to his carefully rehearsed speech about remorse and friendship, and then did something that shocked Frank to his core. Dean forgave him, not immediately, not easily, but completely. The condition was simple: Frank's behavior around Dean's family would be impeccable from that moment forward, or their friendship would be permanently over. Frank agreed without hesitation, and he kept his word. In the years that followed, Frank Sinatra treated Dean's family with a respect and consideration that surprised everyone who knew his usual temperament. At family gatherings, Frank was charming but restrained, entertaining but appropriate, always mindful that he was a guest in Dean's world rather than the star of his own show. The night Deana Martin made Frank Sinatra beg became a turning point for both men. Frank learned that even he had limits, that some relationships were too precious to sacrifice to ego and self-indulgence. Dean learned that true friendship sometimes requires the courage to risk everything in order to protect what matters most. Their professional partnership continued for years afterward, but the dynamic between them had shifted permanently. Frank remained the nominal leader of the Rat Pack, but Dean's moral authority was now acknowledged by everyone, including Frank himself. It was Dean who became the conscience of their group, the man whose approval mattered most because it was hardest to earn and easiest to lose. Years later, when Frank Sinatra was asked about the most important lesson he had learned in his long career, he would sometimes mention a rainy night outside the Beverly Hills Hotel, when he discovered that friendship has boundaries, and crossing them has consequences that fame and power cannot erase. The man who had spent his life making other people beg had learned what it felt like to be on his knees, and the lesson had changed him in ways that made him not just a better entertainer, but a better man.